when we think about global warming on the rise and the auto industry in decline, it's time. The time is right to consider a whole different approach to personal transportation that's both environmentally responsible and economically feasible. Our next speaker, Ryan Chin, hails from MIT, and his fellow PhD students at the Smart Cities Group are working on, I've got to get this right, a foldable, stackable, shareable electric city vehicle that rethinks urban mobility. Please join me in welcoming Ryan Chin.
Thank you. Today's automobile weighs over 20 times the driver. And often, if you look at a comfortable chair today, the one that you're sitting in, it takes about 10 square feet. But an automobile takes over 200 square feet. Cars, gasoline-powered cars, typically rest most of the time. 80% of the time it's being parked, taking up valuable urban real estate. Cars are designed to go over 100 miles per hour, even though in cities we drive 25 to 35. Because of that, we have a real disjoint between what exists and what we don't have. And what's interesting also is that 99% of the cars that we use today are use petroleum-based fuels. And of course, that supply chain is problematic. And of course, if you think about all the negative externalities of automobile use, including congestion and carbon emissions based in our cities, we have a real problem. Now, this is not to say or demonize the auto industry. In fact, the auto industry is a key enabler of our global economy. Goods and services depend on transportation to really get us around. However, we think it's a really good time to radically rethink the automobile, particularly in cities themselves. Our group, called Smart Cities at the MIT Media Lab, is very interested in rethinking the automobile, and also to imagine a city that we want to live in, one that's vibrant, economically stable, diverse, sustainable, smart, and then design an automobile for that place. That was really our goal in designing this automobile. So why is this interesting in terms of cities? Well, we all live in cities generally. In fact, the UN had reported in 2007 that we've reached the threshold of 50% of the world's population lives in cities now. And so this is really different than what it was 100 years ago. More and more people are living in cities. In the next 3 decades, this trend will continue to move up. So our energy future, our transportation future, really depends on what we do in cities themselves. Some interesting statistics to think about in terms of cities. Over 50 years ago, there was only one city that had over 10 million people. That was New York City. Now there's over 20, and most of these are in Asia and in Africa. Those are the key development areas. In terms of energy use, transportation and building operations take up over 60% of the amount of energy that we use in cities. Most of the wealth will be in cities. Most of the growth will be in cities for the foreseeable future. And the most interesting statistic, and eye-popping, and probably you and I have all sort of witnessed this or even taken part in this, is driving here and looking for a parking space. This statistic is around 40% of total gasoline used by cars looking for a parking space, just circling around the block. This is in Manhattan during congested hours. Now, that number may fluctuate up or down 10%, but the important thing is that we are wasting, and that is a factor of not enough land, but also not enough information about where to park. So to give you a better sense of how this affects other places in the world, this is a picture of Taipei. And if you have been to Taipei, you'll notice that there are tons and tons and tons of scooters everywhere. 2-stroke and 4-stroke engine types, no lane division, of course, and 11% of the total pollution is created by scooters. And this is not just in transportation, this is the entire economy of Taiwan. And you can't imagine that perhaps we give everyone here an automobile and have one driver in it, which is actually what we do here in in the United States. The other big challenge, of course, is how do you find your scooter in the sea of vehicles? So there's also a particular problem in cities themselves. As you know, London has a congestion pricing zone. And that's a mitigation in order to reduce the number of private automobiles in cities. That is the number one problem that we have in cities, is there are too many private automobiles with one driver in it. The other issue is that public transportation may be a good solution, but it doesn't solve every problem. I may be carrying something. It may be snowing out. The inflexible schedule prevents me from taking public transportation. The transit station may be far away from my home. What is the big problem in public transportation is what we call, or what transportation planners call, the first mile, last mile problem, which is how do I get from my final destination or my beginning destination to public transit? The public transit station may be far away from where I really want to go. So what has happened in the last decade or so is the emergence of vehicle sharing. Car sharing, particularly here in Cambridge and in Boston, Zipcar is a good example of the emergence of car sharing. And there are tremendous benefits for reducing the amount of congestion, but also the number of cars on the road. Also, what's happened is bicycle sharing has also popped up. In fact, there will be a number of programs coming into the States in the next few years. And the Paris program is perhaps the biggest and most famous program in the world. It has 30,000 bicycles. And this system allows for the pickup of vehicles and drop-off of vehicles anywhere you want. And that's really the model that we're looking at for our project. So what we've developed at the Media Lab is what we call a mobility on demand system or network. And a network consisting of lightweight electric vehicles, charging stations scattered throughout the city where you can go and pick up a vehicle and then drop it off at anywhere else in the city. One-way short-term rental. And when you have one-way short-term rental, instead of two-way rental, which requires you to bring the vehicle back, you can then create a complementary system that solves the last mile, first mile problem and creates, in fact, a sympathetic relationship between public transportation and personal transportation, which is not what you have today. So we've designed 3 vehicles, a car, a scooter, and a bicycle. This first image is of our CityCar, which is this foldable electric shared use electric vehicle. And you can see here we've created a couple of visualizations just to show you what this may be like once we implement it in cities. Now, the reason why we're very interested in creating an ecosystem is because if you can create the 3 different vehicle types, you can pick the appropriate vehicle for the mission at task. In this case, we designed also an electric scooter called the RoboScooter. It's also an electric, lightweight, foldable scooter, foldable vehicle just like the CityCar. Here you can see that we've taken some scenes in Europe, and you can see how this may fit in very tight, narrow streets. The last vehicle is actually a bicycle. It's an electric bicycle. It's called the GreenWheel bicycle. It uses an in-wheel electric motor. And so this ecosystem is critical because then you can pick the right vehicle. And just imagine on a day like today, you might want to drive a bicycle to the supermarket, but then come back with a car with everything that you need in it, right? So you really want to make a multimodal vehicle type. So what we did was we reinvented the wheel, which everyone told us not to do. And in fact, this is how we started off the project. We looked at the development of in-wheel electric motor technology. Here's a video of how that might work. All 3 vehicles use in-wheel electric motors. And in our case, this module contains suspension and steering all inside the wheel. So this module is, just think of it as a hard drive, but in this case with a real spinning wheel that propels people. And that unit, it becomes the locomotive device that allows the vehicle to be very different than what it is today. So the vehicle and how this changes the vehicle architecture is dramatic. Because now you have a wheel motor in each wheel. You don't have a traditional drivetrain. You don't have an engine. You don't have an engine block. You don't have a driveline. It changes the entire scheme. That's, in fact, one of the reasons why we are enabled in order to fold the vehicle. And so here you can see an exploded view of the car. It uses these 4 in-wheel motors, battery system. Most of the elements are snap-on, very modular. You can imagine snapping on and off the wheels whenever there's damage. You just replace the wheel and you're back on the road. You can imagine that the manufacture of this can be very lightweight and easy without the need of a huge factory with lots of robots to produce the vehicle. You can imagine that the wheels can be produced in a mass-produced fashion and the body be locally manufactured. So that's really the change that we're suggesting. Here's the animation of how the CityCar works. Like I said, it's in-wheel motor, lightweight, 2-passenger. Each wheel has the capability of spinning over 120 degrees. You'll see the car can turn on its own axis. It also can park sideways into a parking space, you'll see that it folds and you get out through the front of the car. And you'll also notice that when you park the car, you can park the car perpendicular to the curb and step out onto the sidewalk, which is much safer than on the street, which is what you have with the traditional door. You'll also notice that the seats articulate that help you get in and out of the vehicle. This is our design, and we're actually moving very quickly to build it. The second vehicle is the scooter, and this is a video of the actual prototype that we've built. Again, it's a very lightweight electric. It's half the weight of a traditional gasoline-powered scooter. It weighs 90 pounds, which is half the weight, and it only has 100 parts, total parts. It also has a removable battery pack, so you can take it home and charge it, or you can go to one of these stations and then take out a battery pack and swap it out.
Is a unique concept in urban personal transportation. It's a folding electric motor scooter that provides convenient, inexpensive urban mobility. It's clean, it's green, it's silent. It reduces urban congestion. It folds up to occupy very little space when it parks.
So, how does this work in terms of the city? And this is really the next extension, is how do we create an ecosystem, not beyond just the vehicle itself, but how does this reach into the city? If you think of all the vehicles that consist in this mobility on demand fleet, you can imagine that that is a tremendous amount of battery capacity. And when you have a tremendous amount of battery capacity, then you can plug in the vehicle and accept energy from renewable sources at the right time, perhaps at nighttime when electricity is cheaper, and sell electricity back into the grid during peak usage time in order to balance out the grid. And you really have a tremendous benefit in doing that. Over the long run, you can imagine that having a tremendous effect on how you actually design the entire grid itself and enabling the smart grid to actually be truly smart. On top of that, you have to think of the communications infrastructure on top of which this has to be built on. Each of the vehicles needs to have GPS so that we know where all the vehicles are. The operator needs to know where they are. The users need to know where the stations are, the charging stations are. And users also need to be off-board as well. Off-board, we should be able to also know the availability of vehicles, whether there's one right outside here, Fidelity on Summer Street or not, and where I'm going to. And in fact, this is a model here, an abstract model of a network. And this is a 7-node network. And what happens in shared use situations is that vehicles tend to accumulate in the wrong places. In Paris, you'll go to a station and there's no bikes available. Or you'll go to a station on a bike and there's no parking. So this is a big balancing act. And in other types of sharing programs, that doesn't become a problem. In this case, it does, because you have 3 variables to worry about. One is the number of people waiting for a vehicle, the number of cars available, and the number of parking spaces available. These 3 cues are what you're trying to balance. And so here's a good example. This leftmost node on the upper right has 2 people waiting and 5 cars available, which means that there's an excess of vehicles. You don't actually want to drop off a vehicle there, but you do want to take one away. And the opposite is the middle top, where you have a lot of people waiting, which is probably the problem that we'll mostly have, and only 1 vehicle. So what you want to do is install a variable pricing or dynamic pricing structure in order to incentivize people to take the vehicles and move them to the appropriate places where high pickup demand is going to be. By creating a variable pricing structure, we can incentivize the redistribution of vehicles. In Paris, they actually use trucks to do this. And so you can imagine that there's these guys on trucks, and they pick up the bikes and they move them to the top of the hill because no one wants to ride uphill. So this constant, ineffective optimization of one-way sharing is really a big problem. And actually, you can think of this as a free market system in many ways. The last vehicle is a bicycle. We call it the GreenWheel bicycle. It has an in-wheel electric motor. It has also integrated in the motor a battery system as well, which is very different than traditional electric bikes. This electric bicycle allows or provides electric assist. So if you encounter a hill, you hit the button, it provides power to the rear wheel, so you can overcome the hill very easily or go travel longer distances. It's completely modular, and the battery is incorporated in the wheel, which means that you can take any bicycle, take out the rear wheel, plug in the new unit, and you have now you have instantly electrified the bicycle. The key here is that we also have a wireless controller, which allows for the installation to be very, very easy. And when you go downhill, we can convert the electric motor into a generator and then power back the battery and recapture about 15%, which is roughly what you can do in regen braking situations now. What's also important, too, is that this diagram shows the interior of the GreenWheel, and you can see that the motor and the batteries are all incorporated inside. We're using lithium nanophosphate batteries, which provide a very good range. We can get roughly 30 miles of range, which is much longer than the average commute today. The average bicycle commute is about 5 to no more than 10 miles. And you can get very, very, very effective use of the bike. Here's a video of how it might work. You'll notice here that the green component isn't spinning. The motor is fixed, and the outer casing is actually the only thing that's moving. And because of that, we've reduced the moment of inertia, so it's very easy to start moving. So it's an electric assist. You'll see Arthur, who's running this thing, is using the throttle. You can get very high speeds using this. In fact, we have to govern it down to reduce the amount of speed that you have. You can pedal simultaneously with the motor. You can not have the motor at all, or you can use the motor exclusively. You can charge the bike by plugging in, or by pedaling, or by going downhill. So you have three choices of riding and 3 choices of charging up the bike. To wrap up, I will talk about how this might be implemented here, or any city that you might live in. This is a study that we did of Taipei. We did a lot of work with them because they sponsored some of the work on the scooter. And these little dots represent different things. The blue dots represent convenience stores. If you've ever been to a typical Asian city like Taipei, convenience stores are ubiquitous. They're basically everywhere. Every block has one. The red dots represent schools. The green dots represent the subway stations. So if you imagine taking the schools, the convenience stores, the subway stations, and the bus stops, and placing one of the vehicles that we've suggested, or a rack at every one, you will get to one of these within 5 minutes, 300 seconds, 5 minutes. That's the maximum distance in the urbanized area. In fact, if you've been to Taipei, you realize that even on the periphery, where the density starts to drop, urban density starts to drop, you will still get to one of these vehicle systems within 5 minutes. And the goal here isn't to take the vehicle and drive it all the way to New York. In fact, what we want you to do is take this vehicle, drive it to South Station, or step out of South Station, take the supposed high-speed train and get to New York, and then take a city car to where you want to go for the last mile. So this can work both in inner city and also intracity. Here is a diagram of Boston. And another approach, besides the one I just talked about in Taipei, is to think of the network of vehicles as a series of subnetworks. So a subnetwork would be all of the T stations. Another subnetwork would be all of the bus stations. In Boston, we have a lot of medical institutions, a lot of hospitals. So you can think of a hospital network, or you can think of a school network where you can connect all the schools together. If you build all these subnetworks together, you eventually can create an entire network where then you can reduce the redundancy, right? Eliminate where there are repeat nodes. And of course, the best network is the Dunkin' Donuts network, where you build one at every block. In Italy, it would be at every piazza, but in here, it's at every. Well, it depends. If you're in Seattle, it's every Starbucks, right? So once you have that network in place, you can then imagine building this up both privately, but also in a public case. And what's also important too is that once you build that network up, then you can then begin to imagine what the financial incentive may be for different users. You can even think of a franchise model, that the local store owner actually controls and maintains the bike rack outside their store. That would increase the amount of flow into their facility. Once you have that in place, then you're building up this network. Ultimately, the question that's always asked to me is, how much does the vehicle cost? Well, in this case, you're actually sharing the vehicle, so it's actually a membership. Perhaps you're paying for the time that you use it. And in the case of the dynamic pricing, you may actually be paid to actually go somewhere. A good example, Fenway Park. Everyone goes to the Red Sox game. All the bikes end up in Kenmore Square. Well, what do you do at that time? Do you redistribute the bikes during that time or not? Because now you need vehicles on the other side of the city. Well, it may be a good case that at the end of the game, you want actually vehicles to be redistributed back to Fenway Park to pick up people, if you're redistributing them to begin with. So if you can create the right kind of incentives, then you're going to create the economic value, which is depending on the elastic behavior of users themselves. The last slide is just to thank everyone here. I'm very glad to show the work. I also want to thank my teammates, my colleagues at the Media Lab. It's truly a multidisciplinary group. Our goal is to implement these systems in a city coming near you very soon. And we'd like to thank them very much. Thank you.
And actually, I'd like to congratulate Ryan and his team. They just were awarded the Buckminster Fuller Challenge Award and were given a good sum of money to develop their prototypes into reality. So congratulations, Ryan.